It's a privilege to have each of you in class today, and as I often say when our kids are little, but we still say a lot, welcome to the best day of the week. It's always a blessing to be with God's people. I've entitled our discussion today, Becoming All Things to All Men, and we'll kind of explain this as we go along. But in the central idea, I have a word that I just wanted to explain a little bit. I just made this statement. Paul chose, and I use the term accommodation, over standing up for my rights. And what we're going to see in this is that in this kind of the heart of the middle section of 1 Corinthians, back from chapter 6 all the way through chapter 10, there's kind of a thread that runs through, and that is that some people who feel like now that they're Christians, they have a freedom and a liberty that they didn't have before. And a slogan and a motto apparently in the church in Corinth was, well, all things are lawful for me. And in this section, Paul is going to use himself as an example to say, the real issue isn't, is it lawful for me? The real issue is, does my behavior have either both a positive or a negative effect on someone else? And he's going to use himself as an example that he has some very specific rights as an apostle that he chooses not to use. And this will all be within, as we're going to see, this discussion of all things to all men. We mentioned this last week, but I wanted to kind of bring this back together. And what's hard for, well, it's hard for all of us at different times, but what's hard for a new Christian is that initially, and especially for people who come out of the world, how do you establish new boundaries where, and I use the colors, things that are white, that are right, they're going to be right in every situation. There's things on this other side that are red, that are wrong in every situation. But there are some things that I call matters of conscience in the middle. And this is hard to say, so just help me as I work through this. Because of culture and because of conscience, there are some things that some people can do just with a free and open conscience with no problems at all. And there are other things that for another person, this may be a real struggle. It may be even a stumbling block. And it's these issues in the middle that are the challenge, because if a person just goes through and says, well, all things are lawful for me, I can do whatever I want to, that freedom and exercising that freedom may cause a weaker brother or sister both to stumble into sin. And so Paul is going to discuss this whole question of matters of conscience and matters of culture. This is a really simple illustration, but it's just something none of us would think about, at least from my background. I listened to a man who had worked with native Indians in Guatemala. The best I can hear their enunciation was the Quiché Indians, and they live way up in the hills in Guatemala. And one of the things that he said, when you go to another person's farm, he said, you never kick any of the rocks that are around the post and stuff. And you'd be thinking, why would you not kick rocks? Well, for people who were pagans in that culture, these had to do with warding off evil spirits and different gods. And something that we would never even think about in that culture was just a major, major issue. And so the guy said, you just learned, and he said, it's not that you would just by habit do that, but you just would not kick any of the rocks and stuff that were around, because for these people, as they were in different types of spiritism, different types of animism, worshiping different gods and different spirits, this was very much a sacred thing. You have to both come into a culture like that, you have to learn things of that nature, and it's something in our culture would never even cross our mind. And so those are the kinds of things that I think about in terms of the things that are in this middle area. And I just described them in this way. The things that were read are things that are wrong in every culture, every time, all the time. And that's why, using Paul's term from Galatians, the works of the flesh. Doesn't matter where you are, doesn't matter what situation you're in. These are things that are going to be wrong every time, in every place, all the time. The same thing's true on the other extreme with the fruit of the Spirit. And when Paul finishes that section, he says, well, against such things there's no law. Well, these things are going to be right in every culture, in every place, all the time. But then here are these matters of conscience that are in the middle. And this is because of culture and conditioning. And for one person, they may be entirely harmless. And then for another person, they may be very, very difficult. This is a very small thing, but it's, again, a part of this middle ground. Culturally, and especially with guys, girls to some degree, but especially with guys, it's very culturally appropriate in Australia to just absolutely insult a close friend as a compliment. I mean, just nearly raw to the bone. And as we first moved there, I had a close Australian friend, and we were just talking one day, and he said, and again, this is just me, I'm not used to being called a Yankee, and so that was just the normal term. And so my Australian friend said, well, I need to have a talk with you as a Yankee. He said, when we really like someone, we express that by insulting them. And he said, I've seen some Americans get their feelings hurt, and when they're being told culturally, we like you and we accept you, then they get offended and draw away. And so you just need to get ready that if someone really likes you, they're just going to insult the life out of you. And I'm just thinking, that's not how we do it. But it's very true. And in other words, it's kind of like a compliment. And it's very different in our culture than how we do that. And as time goes by, the more someone knows you and the better they like you, the deeper they insult you. Well, we don't do that, at least where I grew up from. And so here comes the issue. We're to honor our elders, and those who teach the word are to be given double honor. And so I told my Australian friends, does that mean you insult an elder twice? If you're going to show him honor. And that's a little trivial thing, but in every culture there are just different expressions, different ways. And the primary example, though, that Paul uses is this meat offered to idols, because that was the meat supply for a city like Corinth, and the majority of meat that was eaten was the remaining part of something that had been offered as a sacrifice. And so, number 3 on the first page, Paul is going to draw a strong contrast between knowledge, and I'm saying knowledge by itself, on its own, and love, and you can anticipate this as we come to later chapters in 1 Corinthians, acting out of regard for others. So here's the person with knowledge, and he used the term, these people can be puffed up, and this would be a part of the all things are lawful group in the church. He who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know. Verse 7, chapter 9. Not everyone, chapter 8. Not everyone has the same knowledge. your knowledge can become a stumbling block, and knowledge on its own can destroy a brother. And then look at the contrast that's going to be developed. As Paul starts talking about love, love is going to build up. And we're going to come to this term, Lord willing, next week. The basic word for encouragement and edify has the stem of the word house. Oikonomia, and house is the oikos. And the same way that you would physically build a house with different structures and things, then Paul is going to use this word to talk about spiritually strengthening and building people up. And rather than just going through life and saying, this is lawful for me, I don't care how it impacts anyone else, Paul says, no, love is that which builds up, and our house metaphor is going to become an important part of that. It's also the means by which we are known by God. And we finished with this last week, and we'll come back to it. It's not as much that we know God as it is that God knows us. And loving other people is one of the ways that we express that, and we know that. Love is the careful exercise of Christian freedom. I may be free to do something, but I think our strongest application for us, we may choose to do or not to do certain things with people if we know that this matter is a matter of conscience or a matter of offense to them. And love will forfeit individual rights to prevent a Christian from stumbling. So the meat offered to idols, I use the term as like a case study. And here's the contrast. We have freedom on one side. We have the concern for love on the other. And then knowledge and the people who claim to know things. Paul is talking that love needs to be the predominant thing. So I think this is an important point. This is number 5. Paul knew the difference in possessing knowledge and being possessed by knowledge. And through the years, and even just recently, I was talking with someone, and the comment was just made, well, if I can do this, this is no one else's business what I do. And I understand that to some degree. But on the other hand, that also is leaning toward the, well, all things are lawful for me. And that's one part of it. And then the other side, which they're not considering, is, well, and how does my action impact and affect someone else? So conscience is shaped by culture. It's also shaped by our background and a number of other things. And what is very helpful to one person may damage another person. The all things are lawful for me, and I think me is the key word. That person's focus is primarily, this is my freedom, I'm in Christ, I can do what I want to do. Where the question is, and let's say it this way, love says, my liberty and my freedom must be considered in light of the impact that this action has on another person's conscience. And there's still going to be an ongoing conflict through this middle part of Corinthians between knowledge and love. And Paul comes down on the side of love every time and trying to be thoughtful and considerate of our actions as they have to do with others. So in addition to this whole issue of all things are lawful for me, which we're going to the next chapter, there are also some people in Corinth who are questioning and doubting Paul's apostleship. And we're just going to touch on this briefly in a second when we look at this. But, you know, the original apostles were obviously selected in that sense. But Paul's going to use this expression we're going to see in Galatians. He is an apostle born out of due time. So let's read through chapter 9. And notice as he continues this discussion of all things are lawful, that he's going to talk about, yes, he is an apostle, and then he is going to use the rights that he has an apostle that he chooses not to exercise as an example for the people who are really stuck on the all things are lawful for me side of things. 1 Corinthians 9 in verse 1. And notice we're going to have a whole series of questions. And Brother Kelsey would talk about this sometimes. He said, when Paul asks a question, he is wanting the people on the other side to pause and even answer the question as it's asked. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? And are you not my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. And he's basically saying the very existence of the church, with him being commissioned to preach the gospel as an apostle, the very existence of the church was like the seal of ownership and authenticity of him being an apostle. This is my defense for those who would examine me. And you can tell by that there are some who, and we've gone all the way back to, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Paul, I'm of Christ. And so there are still those who are questioning the authenticity of his apostleship. Verse 4, do we not have the right to our food and drink? And we're going to come back and look at this verse a little bit more later, but this is very interesting. Do we not have the right to be accompanied by a wife as the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? And we'll pause on this when we turn the page, but in one verse, here's like a little snapshot of some personalities in the early church. And notice, the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas are those who Paul says have the right to be accompanied with a wife as they do the Lord's work. Verse 6, is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? And who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? And you can just see he continues to ask these questions to move his point along. Verse 8, do I say this on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it's treading out the grain. Is it for the oxen that God is concerned? Does he not speak entirely for our sake? It was written for our sake because the plowman should plow in hope and the thresher thresh in hope of a share in the crop. And again, here's a very interesting use of an Old Testament passage that the Israelite people would have thought primarily just in terms of the agricultural side, and Paul is going to apply that to the support of workers and their wives and eventually their families. Verse 11, if we have sown spiritual good among you, is it too much if we reap your material benefits? If others share this rightful claim upon you, do not we still more? And then I think this is specifically in view of the all things are lawful for me group. Notice this next section. Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. And then he's going to use examples from the temple. Do you not know that those who are employed in temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Verse 15, but I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing this to secure any such provision, for I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. If I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me, and woe if I do not preach the gospel. For I do this of my own will. I have a reward, but if not of my own will, I am entrusted with a commission. Well, what then is my reward? Just this, that in my preaching I may make the gospel free of charge, not making full use of my right in the gospel. This will come up in 2 Corinthians, but especially in Greek culture, there was just this huge divide between common laborers and people who were free. And a part of the way that Paul is going to be offensive to some in the church in Corinth is that what is his occupation? He's a leather worker. If you are traveling, it would be hard probably to take provisions to make entire tents. And he's probably in a group of people, and who knows, belts, shoes, things that you could do without a lot of supplies. But Paul is going to engage oftentimes in working with his hands. And there would be some people in the church in Corinth that free people just don't do that. That's the work of slaves. That's the work of common laborers. And we're going to see and kind of close this whole section with Paul saying, I have become all things to all men. And that's going to be true in most cases. However, to prevent anyone from saying he is abusing his rights, he is either going to accept support from someone else, or he is going to work with his hands so that no one in Corinth will have any control over how he teaches and preaches, because to the Corinthians, his preaching is free from any financial obligation. And this is going to be something that every time and we're going to see this, and it's very important, I have become all things to all men, and that's true. However, in the area of preaching the gospel free, if this offends someone, Paul is still going to do that to prevent them from implying that he has any obligation to them, and it also leaves him free to preach the gospel as he ought to. Hopefully this doesn't happen a lot, and I know Les will be familiar with circumstances like this, but we had an older couple with us at Eastside who had retired from preaching, and twice through the week at different places, he was given instructions, and whether it was elders or the business meeting, you are not to preach on this and this and this while you're here. He went home and told his wife, you need to start collecting some cardboard boxes because we won't have a job Sunday afternoon. And he just said, we're not going to be mercenaries, and if I can't preach the whole counsel of God, I'm not going to preach. And so he was told not to preach on a specific topic, and he did the next Sunday just to make the point, the gospel should not be controlled by financial obligation. And you have to admire, and he didn't have a job to go to. They weren't given severance pay. And you have to admire someone who basically says, no, I'm going to preach the whole counsel of God regardless of the consequences of that. And so behind the scenes, a part of the friction that exists is that there are some Corinthians that would prefer for Paul to be supported by the church, to have the freedom to do that, which he did, but I think he also felt like these people would have some control because of their finances, and in order to teach and preach the whole counsel of God, he will not accept support from them, which is going to offend some of the people in the church, and we'll see more of that in 2 Corinthians. So here we are, chapter 9, verse 19. Though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, that I might win the more. And I went ahead and put numbers on the side, which we'll come back to. 1, to the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. And this is to me a very interesting expression, to those under the law. And I literally, the word here is literally like, here's the teaching of the law of Moses, and they literally are living under that law. I became as one under the law, though I myself, so let me rephrase that, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. And so when Paul is with Jewish brethren, especially in a synagogue and other situations, he is not going to exercise any of his freedom in Christ that would cause Jewish people to have a hindrance from hearing the gospel. This is, I think so, a wonder on my part. But as you go through the book of Acts, what's the procedure in virtually every town? He's going to go first to a synagogue and go first to the Jews. In most cases, he's not there by the fourth Sabbath. Usually by the third Sabbath or so, he gets evicted, but at least he gives the Jewish people the opportunity to hear the gospel first, and then when he's expelled from the synagogue, where does he go? He goes to the Gentiles. Well, in many cases, in these communities, if he had started with the Gentiles, that would have offended some of the Jewish people, and so that's going to be a part of the process, is that he will then start with the Jews, and I have a very, very dear friend who's a Seventh-day Adventist, and he is just such a godly person. But it's so hard to talk with people who have this combination of, yes, we keep the Sabbath a day, we keep the law, and they divide the Old Testament law into various other things. But notice very carefully, Paul says, I'm not under the law. And this is going to be a part of his freedom, but when he is talking with Jewish people, and you stop and think, circumcised on the 8th day, of the tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew of Hebrews. If we mentioned this earlier, F.F. Bruce said, I think they probably spoke Hebrew in his house. And people who've been in Portugal and other countries, I remember talking to the Nortons, they said, we spoke Portuguese all day long until supper, and then from supper to bedtime we spoke English, just so the kids would remain bilingual. And so Hebrew of Hebrews, sat under the feet of Gamaliel. There's nothing about Judaism that Paul doesn't know inside out, and he doesn't abuse the freedom that he has now that he's not a Jew by religion, but he observes their culture to try to win Jews. Secondly, verse 21, to those outside the law, I became as one outside the law. I'm sorry, this my warped sense of humor. Can you imagine having been a Jew all of your life and you go to a Gentile's house and they have bacon in the baked beans? And remember, a decade later, Peter says, Lord, I've never touched anything unclean. And as a Jewish person, to go to a church fellowship with Gentiles would just it would just be such a challenging thing because of your cultural scruples. And Paul says, okay, when I'm with those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being without the law of God, but notice, I'm under the law of Christ. And isn't that an interesting expression? The Jewish people, before they become Christians, are going to be under the law of Moses. And then if you do the teaching in the law of Christ, then Paul says, yes, and when I'm with Gentiles, non-Jews, then I accommodate, I work with them. However, I am under the law of Christ, that I may win those outside the law. So if you look at the next page, this is verse 22, and here's the third example he gives. He says, to the weak, I became weak that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men that I might by all means save some. And this to me is the contrast to the all things are lawful to me community. All things to all men, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessing. And then he just kind of changes the metaphor completely and goes to an athletic imagery. Do you not know that in a race, all the runners compete, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, and it's going to be actually a pine wreath. But we an imperishable. I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one who beats the air, but I pummel my body and subdue it, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. And this word for pummel my body is the word for like to give someone a black eye. And Paul talks about he is free from so many things, but he also exerts self-control in terms of running the race. So I want just to touch on these, and we'll walk through these quickly. But notice the different people and personalities that Paul has mentioned under the thing about rights. Do we not have the right to be accompanied by a wife as the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord? And when you look at the term apostle, and there's several of these, but I'm back in Acts chapter 1, when they are replacing Judas, someone who has accompanied us all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day he was taken up, one of these men must become with us a witness to his resurrection. In various groups today, and you'll see this driving around town, people are designated as apostles. And technically the word apostle means one sent. I'm always uncomfortable with this from the point of view that the original apostles had to be someone who saw the resurrected Lord. And so Paul is going to make this statement in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 8, that he was an apostle born out of due time, but because of the Damascus Road, and there's several of these that the Lord appears to him, he claims and has the right to be an apostle, even though he wasn't one of the original 12. But notice this, the other apostles traveled with their wives doing the Lord's work. And this is one of those unique places that you won't find this in other places, but we're going to see Cephas at Peter, and other than Peter, then Paul just mentions there are others of the original group who are involved in the Lord's work, but they're traveling with their wives. He also mentioned the brothers of the Lord. And when we do New Testament, we've always talked about this, but in Mark 6, the carpenter, the son of Mary, and then you have James, Joseph, Judas, and Simeon. And we know James, he's going to be the pillar of the church, very much in the middle of Acts. I also think Jude is the writer. Judas is the writer of the book of Jude. And while we don't get any other descriptions, Paul is going to tell us that the brothers of the Lord are traveling with their wives, doing the Lord's work. And then here's Cephas. Jesus gives Peter this unique name in John 1:42. And this is really sad. Through the years, I've talked to people who have been taught that Peter was the first pope and therefore he wasn't married. I'm sorry, you can't have a mother-in-law without being married. Okay, I'm not trying to be silly, but I'm just stating the obvious. And I was talking with a lady once. We were on a campaign talking to people, And I just told her, I said, if I can show you in your Bible that Peter had a wife, would you believe it? And she says, well, not if my priest tells me that he didn't. And I just thought, okay, we don't have anything else to talk about if you're not going to listen to the Word of God. But he has to have a wife if Jesus heals his mother-in-law. Plus, when you come to 1 Peter chapter 5, we find that he is a fellow elder. And so from Timothy and Titus, an elder also has faithful children. And so we find out from this that Peter not only has a wife that travels with him, if he is a fellow elder, then he also will have faithful children as well. And then here's the other thing I think is very important. Paul and Barnabas have this sharp disagreement over John Mark. And the word disagreement there is like a small rock in your shoe. And if you're walking around and it doesn't have to be a really big rock, but at some point you're just going to stop and take it out because of the irritation. Yes, in Galatians, Paul is going to reprove both Peter and Barnabas when they withdrew from eating with the Gentiles, but Paul doesn't spend any time being vindictive after the disagreement with Barnabas. And in fact, I always laugh when I read 2 Timothy chapter 4, go and get John Mark and bring him with you. He is useful to me in ministry. And he's basically saying Barnabas was right. And it's easy to have difficulty, to have tension between people, but Paul didn't use that as an ongoing struggle later in his ministry. So if you look at the back page, Paul's going to mention a soldier, a vineyard, a shepherd, and the muzzling of an ox. And again, I think he does this to say, I have the right, but I'm not going to exercise that in these things. And we've mentioned the Jews, the Gentiles, and the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. And I think what this means to you and I is that, especially as we deal with people who are not in the Lord's church, we should just be very conscious as we talk to and find out about each person, dealing with them in such a way that gives them the best opportunity to hear the gospel. And if we forego some of our personal rights to accommodate and to help them, then that's very much within the description of what Paul's talking about. He closes at the end of the chapter and just kind of turns the page and does a totally different thing and starts talking about running the race. Every other year they had, well, that's not true. Every 4 years they would have the Olympics in Athens, but in between, the Isthmus Games were held in Corinth. And for example, the Commonwealth Games are held every 2 years in between the Olympics. And especially in long distance running, if you bring Rhodesia, Kenya, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, England, the Commonwealth Games are very, very competitive. And so in between the 4 Olympic Games, then they have the Commonwealth Games. Well, most of the races that were run, they ran without clothes. That was just how the Greek races were run. But what was interesting is that you weren't just judged on where you placed, you were also judged in the form and how you ran. So if you think figure skating, certain gymnastics, the score is the combination of those. And I was listening to a teacher and he said, you could win the race, but if you ran ugly, you wouldn't get the prize. So you were judged not only in terms of where you placed, but you were also judged in terms of the form that you used with doing that. And so the passage in Hebrews 12 comes to mind. We are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely. Let us run with endurance, with patience, the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. We had a track coach my senior year who had been down in Texas, and the mile relay, there's 4 guys that run. And his tailback in football was 6'2", 210, just a real outstanding athlete. And he was the 4th runner on the mile relay. But he lost count, and he thought there was one more runner, and he looks up, and just right up here is number 3, and it's his turn to run. So he's got his sweats on, and as he steps out of his sweats, his shorts end up in his sweats. He looks up the coach, and the coach says, run. So he pulls his jersey as close as he could down, takes the baton, wins the race, and then runs right out the track and runs to the bus, and then wants his buddies to bring his clothes to him. And he later said, I would rather have the embarrassment of running without my shorts than to have to face my coach because we didn't win the race. Just a reminder, we're all in a race. But look at the discipline that athletes go through in terms of self-control to win a physical crown. And Paul says, run to win the prize. And he talks about the importance of keeping himself qualified so he may win the prize. And may we do the same.